welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I am joined by not just a friend of mine, but a friend of the show. Because if you've been here twice, you are a friend of the show. So welcome to your new role, your new status. Could you please introduce yourself to our listeners?
Sure. I'm Larisa Grollemond. I am Associate Curator of Medieval and Renaissance Manuscripts at the Getty Museum in Los Angeles.
Thanks so much for joining us again. Last time, I guess maybe 2-ish years ago now, you were here to talk about your gorgeous exhibit and book about sort of the afterlife of the Middle Ages in fantasy and in pop culture. I'd love if we could talk a little bit. Well, first, maybe reintroduce our listeners to a little bit of what your role and your research interests look like, and maybe a little bit about the inception point of this exhibit, like what led you to this topic.
Sure. Yeah. So I am a curator of manuscripts at a museum, an art museum specifically, which means that we have a mandate really to show our work to the public and as wide a public as we can. So we have a collection of medieval and Renaissance manuscripts here at the museum that ranges from about 900 to 1600 or so. There are some outliers to that. And are mostly Western European with some additions from Ethiopia and Armenia and the Islamic Mediterranean. But really what I do here is create exhibitions for our manuscripts gallery space. And we do about 3 to 4 exhibitions a year in our space that are relatively small. They're usually 20 to 25 objects, sometimes a little bit larger, depending on the theme and the kind of gallery space that we have. But really those are drawn from the permanent collection and often supplemented by some local loans. But we really try to do interesting exhibitions that are kind of drawn from the strengths of the permanent collection, but really try to tell different stories with that. So yeah, last time I was here, we were talking about the fantasy of the Middle Ages with my co-author and co-curator, Brian Keene. And since then, I've just been chugging away doing exhibitions for the space. And today we're talking about Rising Signs, the Medieval Science of Astrology, which is, I think, like a lot of the things I do, drawn from social media almost, like the kind of germ of it. I did an exhibition earlier this year about blood in medieval art that also extended to kind of contemporary conversations. And the impetus for that was an Instagram reel that I did, a little video about menstruation in the Middle Ages, which is kind of one of the most frequently asked questions that we get. And I had also been doing this series of astrology videos about the nature of medieval astrology and kind of the interests and differences between medieval astrology and contemporary astrology, especially doing a video for each month, each zodiac sign as it kind of passed. And there were so many questions about that. Like, is it a good time for bloodletting? Should I be planting crops? That kind of medieval advice that comes along with astrological seasons. And I had been sort of thinking about a show about medieval astrology for a while, but we have this thing in Southern California called PST Art, which is short for Pacific Standard Time. It's an initiative that the Getty Foundation actually funds every 5 years now. And always these are based on themes. So there are exhibitions, not just at the Getty, but kind of throughout Southern California, all on this theme at different kinds of institutions who are interpreting that theme differently. And the theme for this particular iteration of PST was art and science. So this was a really great opportunity to kind of show the scientific side of medieval astrology. And there's a big show up at the Getty right now called Lumen, the Art and Science of Light, which looks at the kind of representation and interpretation of light in medieval Europe in the long Middle Ages. Like 800 to 1600 or so, which is a very long Middle Ages. So this was kind of an opportunity to have kind of the flip side to that. There's a lot of astronomical equipment and kind of visual culture in Lumen, and this was an opportunity to have astrology represented also in the galleries. So if you go to see both shows, you get both astronomy and astrology. This is a very long answer to your question. That's where it started.
My goodness, that's so interesting. Yeah, I really love the way that it seems to, as you say, speak to other exhibits like at the museum, but also with what other institutions are doing. And I love thinking about how all academics, wherever you are at museums or universities, you're just part of one big kind of conversation that's going on all the time.
This is a particularly fun one because there are lots of institutions who are exploring art and science in different geographic and faith traditions, but also different chronologies. So there is lots of shows up right now that are thinking about these kind of pendant issues in contemporary art, especially. But this was kind of a way to extend the conversation in history a little bit too, but also speak to like a topic that people are really interested in, because astrology is so much a part of, I don't know, internet culture. It's a part of like the zeitgeist in a way that is I think even more than it used to be like 10 or 15 years ago. People are aware of astrology in a way, or they're and aware of like the underlying astronomical contours of it too. Like they know about eclipses and Mercury retrograde and like all of these, I think, scientific phenomena which inform astrological thinking in a way that like would have been very familiar to medieval people.
That is such an interesting observation about like how astrology has become like this really mainstream thing. Because you're absolutely right. Like when I was a teen in the 90s, like into tarot and astrology and charts, like I was one of like a couple weird kids, like usually in the theater department who were doing that. But now, yeah, you see it everywhere on every social media platform. And it's kind of like, oh, like, is this how Marvel fans have felt for the past 15 years? Like,
Totally. I mean, but it's like a part of like meme culture now. And one of the interesting things about doing like public tours and just tours in general of the show is that people come with a lot of knowledge about not just their sun sign, but also their rising sign and their moon sign, their big three, as it were. But they know about their natal chart, and they know about like the lingo. There's transits and all of these sorts of things that affect astrological interpretation in ways that like I think are quite familiar. And there are aspects of the show I think people have been surprised about. One of the main kind of applications of astrology in the Middle Ages is, of course, for medicine and the diagnosis and treatment of disease and bloodletting and kind of an understanding of the individual within kind of a larger cosmological system, versus the more contemporary interpretation of like astrology as a way to understand the self and understand personality and compatibility, which is not so much part of the medieval kind of understanding of astrology. It gets into sort of like personality types, like temperaments, and the overlap of that with humoral balance and medicine in particular. But I think people are kind of more accustomed to seeing astrology as a way of like self-knowledge and self-understanding, where I think medieval people would have understood it much more in terms of understanding like practical things, what to do this month, what to do this season, how to treat particular, common ailments and that kind of thing.
To that point, I think this exhibit and astrology is a particularly good way for thinking about how in the Middle Ages, the boundaries between things like medicine and religion and magic and science were drawn quite differently than they are now. And then how like being in one category didn't necessarily keep you from being in another category as well. So could you talk about some of the other roles that astrology played maybe in these areas that would be kind of surprising to us modern people?
Yeah. So the show kind of takes the zodiac as a little bit of a case study of like astrology in visual culture and in culture kind of more broadly. But one of the most frequently asked questions I get is about the appearance of the zodiac symbols, the same ones that we know today. Like if you know that you're Sagittarius and that's the archer, centaur, like it's the same set of symbols. The appearance of those things in medieval devotional books in particular. And so there are a number of books in the show that are books of hours. So these are personal prayer books. They're meant to guide individual devotion, but they often start with calendars. And so the zodiac is a way of structuring time in that way, of visualizing time and visualizing seasons over the course of a year. But they're part of these prayer books. And so, as you're saying, the kind of overlap of faith, religious belief and practice, and the zodiac are kind of one and the same. And one of the most kind of frequently asked questions I get is like, is this consistent with a Christian worldview? Or is it like okay that there are these sorts of, I think, symbols and things that people associate with like pagan belief or pagan practice because it is associated with the movement of celestial bodies and the interpretation of those. But this is a point that is made in the show too, that like, because God is believed to have put everything where it should be on Earth and in the universe more broadly, then it's sort of okay for humanity to interpret those things because they are already divinely ordained and kind of divinely set. I think when you get into aspects of divination and like future telling, that's where it gets a little squishy because it's like people are interpreting God's will in a way that feels maybe presumptuous or overstepping in some way. But the interpretation of like the position of constellations and the movements of different kinds of planets and other celestial bodies, like those are up for interpretation and they are integrated into an understanding of the passage of time in a way that is, I think, maybe unfamiliar to us today because it is such an agricultural system. It's such a seasonal system that the kind of coincidence of different zodiac signs with different seasons is just an understanding of the passage of a year. So an astrological year and a calendar year are not different for medieval people. They're seeing those things as the same. And these calendars where there's zodiac symbols, they're really just lists of saints' feast days. So the kind of rhythm of Christian devotion is also tied to an understanding of the rhythm of these zodiac seasons, month to month too. So I think that's maybe a surprising kind of overlap or a surprising connection for people because we think of astrology as kind of a discrete thing that is happening aside from time passing and the tracing of time passing, which is kind of like an inert, benign thing, but it's really not, right? There's so much history and context in the way that we even track time, that of course, like the overlap of these zodiacal seasons are part of the way that we think of a year too, but maybe less integrated than it was in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, for sure. And I think a lot of people would probably be surprised by medieval Christianity generally being okay with some aspects of astrology. Because I remember looking at documents from like the Satanic Panic of the 80s and 90s, and being into astrology was, a sign of Satanism in some of the
Which is crazy, right? Because it's so much a part of medieval visual culture. Like you have representations of the zodiac signs on church portals, and like they're really these are the same thing. I mean, astronomy and astrology are the same field for all intents and purposes in the Middle Ages. So thinking about the observation of astronomical phenomena and the interpretation of that on Earth being astrology, like those are two sides of the same coin. So those are not different. But there's a real kind of practical application to astrology in the Middle Ages, which I think is maybe less today. We think of it as more pseudoscience and kind of more woo-woo.
Yeah. One of the most interesting things that I learned from looking at the exhibit materials was that your sun sign may have been different in the Middle Ages than it is today, and mine is in this 21st century, I am a Leo, but in the Middle Ages, I would have been a Virgo. And I was like, oh my gosh, I need to like
I
reconsider.
know.
I see myself. Like, is yours different?
Yes, mine's different because I'm a September Virgo in the modern system, but in the Middle Ages, I would be a Libra,
Mm.
which is like crazy.
It is crazy.
Yeah, so the aligning of signs in the Middle Ages is much simpler because each month has a sign and it's sort of a much cleaner, more logical system, really. But the modern system has to do with more precise astronomical observations so that we actually understand the position of these particular constellations in much more like closer detail so that we understand the signs, the dominant sign being kind of overlapping months usually. And so, yeah, the exhibition has an interactive where you can find your medieval zodiac sign and get your like humoral balance and dietary recommendations and things based on it. But it has, I think, really like upended people's sense of identity in a way. They're like, wait a second, I am not the thing that I thought I was. And it really does change. I don't know, it changes your sort of bearing in a way. But I think that it also speaks to like how central astrology is in modern culture in a way that like people are not just knowledgeable about their sign, but they also feel some sort of like emotional connection to it and that it explains them in a way that feels sort of like elemental or basic. And so to have that be changed is like, it's really weird. I mean, it's like a weird feeling to be told, actually, you're not this thing, but you're this other thing. And it's like a whole new set of characteristics that you have to then adopt or learn.
Absolutely. I think it should be added to the big three. I think we should be talking about your sun, moon, rising, and your medieval sign.
Medieval sign. Is it's usually like because it would be the one right before or after what your current sign is. But I just never thought of myself as a Libra because I was talking to a friend of mine about this. And the question is like whether or not like knowing your sun sign from an early age, do you actually modify your personality to like be based on that sign? Because it explains you in some way. And so by the time you get to adulthood, you're like, well, it's just because I'm a Virgo. Like that's a Virgo thing. So it excuses certain kinds of behaviors or it explains certain kinds of behaviors. And to have that like upended or changed, I think also shows how kind of fragile the system is. Because the other thing too is that ruling planets are different in the Middle Ages. So because there are, of course, fewer known planets. And so the like on the labels for the zodiac signs in the show, I have corresponding planet rather than ruling planet because I have all these astrology ringers coming through the show being like, that's not the ruling planet for that sign. And well, it was different. And I did have a public program with two contemporary astrologers to talk about the correspondence between some of the medieval material and contemporary material and took them through the show. And they were like, well, I can see, you know, Saturn being the ruling planet for this sign. And I was like, okay. Like, I am not an astrologer, but, you know, I think I have learned so much, I think, about the practice of contemporary astrology and the kind of generalized belief systems around it are kind of they're almost like a faith system for the 21st century in a way that is, I think, different because I don't know that I was prepared necessarily for people coming into the show with so much prior knowledge. Like I knew that there would be a lot, but it's not usually when I give tours of medieval shows, there's a lot to tell. There's a lot of context. And that's the same with this, but people have come to it, I think, with a lot of previous knowledge that does really inform their interpretation of the historical material.
Mm. Wow, that's super interesting. I'd love if we could talk a little bit more about, you mentioned collaborating with astrologers, which is so cool. And I'd love to know more about what sort of collaboration beyond that goes into, bringing an exhibit like this to the public. So like right after the inception point that we talked about at the top of this interview, like what happens after that? Who do you go to with the idea? Who do you ask for help? Like what is the process then?
This is a very long, mostly administrative process, which is not very interesting, I guess. There's a lot of emails involved. So I have exhibition ideas, I talk them over with my senior curator, and we kind of decide where they fit on the schedule. And we like to have a balance of secular and religiously kind of concentrated shows. So it's not all religion all the time. It's not all secular all the time. This is kind of both. Like in the Middle Ages, everything is kind of both, but we try to make those distinctions. And then I kind of get the green light to go ahead with developing the show, which essentially means doing the research and writing the label copy as I develop a checklist of objects. And for this show, there's a number of permanent collection objects from the manuscripts collection. There's also a number of objects from the Research Institute's collection, which they have all of the early printed material. And I definitely wanted to have some of that represented because there's so much scientific discourse and kind of intellectual discourse around this topic happening at the end of the 15th century when print starts to really take off in Western Europe. So there are a number of titles that are, like poetic odes to the constellations, but then also printings of this 13th century author, Johannes de Sacrobosco's writings about the universe and lots of diagramming. And so the visual culture of those is super interesting. It is indebted a lot to the medieval material. So the calendar images get taken forth into print. And so I wanted to have kind of that story there as well. So there's manuscript and printed objects and kind of doing the development of research on those things and kind of doing some of the initial writing of the text. I'm really lucky here at the Getty to work with a team of like professional editors who take what I give them and make it beautiful and concise and super clear. But then I also work really closely with like our exhibition design team. So once an idea for an exhibition is approved by all of the kind of upper administrators who think more kind of broadly about the exhibitions program across all the galleries. And for this, because it's a PST show, there's something like 10 PST shows at the Getty up right now. So they're all on different aspects of art and science. So this was kind of part of that package, which is a kind of other administrative story. But once that's kind of set, we get assigned kind of a whole team of people. And our exhibition design team, I work really closely with them to talk about like gallery colors, like paint colors and design kind of ideas. And for the show, we have like a starry kind of light display. So there's there's filters over some of our regular gallery lights, which look like stars, which is really cool. And the rest of the gallery is quite dark. So it feels kind of hopefully magical. But we also decided to do kind of like a circular theme because so many of the diagrams are circular. And so the shape of the section text is circular and some of the other design elements are kind of echoing those shapes. So I work closely with them to kind of develop all of that stuff. The gallery text goes into proofs, and we start looking at exactly how the information will appear on all of the label text, on the section text and kind of introduction text, as well as the case labels. And that happens. Yeah, timelines for shows are different, but that's usually like a year out is kind of the early year and a half is kind of the where it begins, and then leading up to a show, all of this stuff takes place. And then finally we get to install the show, and that's also not my job. We have a wonderful team of conservators who do the kind of cradle fabrication, all of the things that hold the books in the cases. They work with the design team also to figure that out, kind of what will look like in the cases. And then, everything gets installed and the show opens, 18 months or so after I've had the initial idea. So it's really like, I always think of, to use a sports metaphor, curators as quarterbacks. We sort of like think of the whole look and feel of the show and the content. But then there are this whole like mess of people. And people with different kinds of expertise who really take the show forward in a lot of different ways. And we, of course, consult on those details, but I really rely on those folks to bring the show to life in a lot of really like practical ways. And then there are lots of kind of adjacent pursuits. So there's public programming, there's social media. We want to advertise the show. So there's communications, people who work on that aspect of it. So I was really happy to have that program with the two contemporary astrologers, because like the idea of astrology online was such a core part of why I wanted to do the show in the first place, that it was like super important to have that conversation. And it was really, really interesting because they had so much interesting stuff to say about not just like the legacy of medieval astrology, but how much it is different today. But I still maintain that like medieval people would have loved Instagram. So like they would have been all over Instagram astrology anyway. But it's been such I think a learning process for me, bringing this kind of material to a more public audience, is getting that public feedback then too about like the way that astrology works in people's lives.
Yeah, that is absolutely fascinating. And it is really interesting to know like the time frame on which that happens. I think like academics are used to things taking kind of a long time, like books and articles to see fruition. But there's also a lot of moving parts and different people you're working with. It sounds like a very complex machine that sort of comes to life to make this happen.
I love museum work for that reason, because there's an opening day and things have to be done by the opening day of the show. And in some ways, it's like a very long timeline, like a year or two to make an exhibition, or sometimes longer if it's a bigger exhibition. Seems like a long time for people. But yeah, to talking to academics, where you might wait for 6, 7, 9, 10 years for a book or article to be published, like it's a short timeline in comparison to that.
Well, thank you so much for this glimpse at not only the exhibit, but at your career and your role at the Getty. It was really fascinating to learn about both. And yeah, I'm so excited for everybody who gets to see this. One last question, and it's probably huge, so take it as you will, but like, what is next for you? What are you working on right now?
Oh boy, what am I not working on right now? So we have, of course, all our upcoming shows in the Manuscripts Gallery. So I'm working on a show right now called Going Places, which is about travel and movement of people and things in the Middle Ages. That will be up next fall. And I'm also working on a book, also inspired actually by a lot of the things that I've done on social media, about medieval hygiene and medieval wellness practices. So everything from bathing and hair removal to ideas about cleanliness and well-being kind of more generally. So that's on the horizon for me as well.
Ooh, that sounds fantastic. So wow. All right. I'm probably going to call
I'm
you.
already inviting myself onto the show for a third time. So.
Hey, I already have so many questions about that. That's great. Yeah, thank you again. This has been really lovely, and it's been nice to catch up and to learn more about your work.
Of course. Thank you, Jen. And for people who are in LA, Rising Science is open until January 5th. And you can also check out all of the social media content that we've created for the show on Instagram, especially at Getty Museum.
Yes. All right, listeners, that's on you. Check that out. Make it to LA if you can, but at very least, check out the social media, because you do have like a really wonderful, both fun and very informative, internet presence for the Getty. So yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, you can find out if it's a good season for bloodletting, which I can never keep track of. But also, like, don't bloodlet, Yeah.
But just know whether it's good to know whether it's a good time or not, but don't do it.
Yeah, exactly. People are always asking me, like, does it actually work? And I'm like, I don't know, and don't find out. Like, just don't do it.
Yeah, the stakes are really high.
Yeah, exactly. Don't mess it up if you try.
All right. This has been wonderful. Thank you again. And we'll see you next time, listeners. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.